Hello, welcome to this lesson. The title of this lesson is Film Genres. The word genre in French means kind or class. Genre studies in cinema attempts to categorize a film into a class in which there are other films with similar features. This classification is done on the basis of a number of attributes, say instantly recognizable patterns like story, settings, subject matter, technology, impact on the audience, and even on the basis of cost of production. Genre study enables us to categorize a film into a particular type or genre, even though there are obvious overlaps and intersections with films in other genres and subgenres. In the beginning years of cinema, the number of films produced in a year were limited, and so was the range of a film. When Charlie Chaplin made City Lights in the year 1931, it was rather easy and convenient to label it as a romantic comedy, based on the nature of its subject, mode, and message. Now there are big budget films that are produced in locations in multiple nations, involving artists and technicians from different parts of the world. So it's a very pretty difficult task to classify films into neat taxonomical schema, as films straddle boundaries and exhibit hybrid nature. Genre classifications are generally applied to popular cinema and not to experimental or avant-garde cinema. Cinematic genres are primarily replications of literary genres, the classifications of which had been started by the classical Greek philosopher Aristotle in the 4th century BCE. Learning objectives: to introduce students to the genre properties of films, to expose the students to the logic and principle of genre classifications, to enable the students to distinguish between films in terms of genre characteristics, and to familiarize them with various genres and subgenres in films. Documentary films and fiction films are the two basic categories in films. The documentary, by its very nature, is oriented toward reality, truth and authenticity being its primary concerns. In the modern world, documentaries make a powerful impact, especially in the political arena. And in formal terms, documentaries are undergoing revision and innovation on a regular basis. Fiction films, on the other hand, continue to have their charm over the audience even in a world where the sway of the digital medium is ubiquitous and powerful.
My name is Anthony Gonzalez.
When there are too many films that vary among themselves in terms of subject matter, treatment, and appeal, it's very pretty confusing to the viewers and critics alike to handle them. Probably out of this sheer necessity of comfortable labels arose the tendency to categorize films into genres. Genre theory is now an essential component of the academic disciplines like film studies. Genre demarcations in film studies borrow heavily from genre theory in literary studies. The renowned film critic André Bazin brought up the concept of genre in his discussion of the Western films in the 1950s. Later, it became an integral part of film theory. Genre classifications in films were heavily influenced by the art forms and categorizations that already existed. For example, the Western films had a prototype in the Western
novels.
Generic labels are subject to changes. The Great Train Robbery, 1903, was seen in a different perspective when it was released, as a crime film or a railroad film. Now it is accepted to be a perfect example of a Western film. Films sometimes display a hybrid nature. Susan Hayward points to the spy films sharing a similar territory with thriller films. Some critics tend to challenge the very logic of genre demarcations in films. The question they ask is whether such distinctions are really there, or are they constructs erected by film critics? There is no general agreement on the number of genres. It varies from critique to critique and book to book. By more conventional accounts, there are those who peg the total number of genres at 10, and yet there are others who may even propose up to 15. Amidst this chaos, there are certain classifications supposed to have more acceptance among viewers and critics. One such list is provided by the American Film Institute, or AFI, and the list consists of 10 genre categories in alphabetical order: animation, courtroom drama, epic, fantasy, gangster, mystery, romantic comedy, science fiction, sports and westerns. Animation films. The history of animation films goes back to the early decades of the 20th century. The first feature-length animation film was titled El Apostle and was released in the year 1917. It was made using the traditional animation methods. Initially, they used a very crude and cumbersome technique of photographing individual drawings, paintings or illustrations and projecting them in quick succession at the rate of 24 frames per second. Frame by frame, hand-drawn images were used for this purpose. There are some film scholars who believe that animations do not deserve the status of a genre, as it is only a technique used in filmmaking. From 1928 to 1960 was the golden period of Hollywood animation. Walt Disney is synonymous with animation, and they set the standard for animation industry as we know it today. Disney's ventures in the 1940s, Pinocchio and Fantasia, were well received at the box office.
Only Pinocchio!
Puppet made of pine. Wait.
I can move.
With the advent of computer-generated images, or CGIs, animations have become multi-million-dollar affairs, creating a huge impact in the film industry and had devoted fans across the world. On the technical front, animation films these days use a wide array of techniques including CGI. There are animation enthusiasts who argue that the genre is underestimated in terms of awards and festivals. The 2009 animation film Avatar, directed by James Cameron, left a deep impression in the industry, and it became the highest grossing film worldwide for almost a decade, even surpassing Cameron's own another film, Titanic. Courtroom dramas. Legal drama or courtroom drama is one of the genre demarcations that the American Film Institute makes. One defining feature of this genre of the film is that the legal system has a central role in the text of the film. Some legal dramas also make it a point to follow the career and lives of fictional or legal professionals like attorneys and jurors.
The accused Narayan Kamble, age 65, is charged under Indian Penal Code, Section 306, abetment of suicide in the death of Vasudev Pawar, age 25, who was a worker under contract with the Bruhan Mumbai Municipal Corporation.
Sometimes the focus may shift out of the courtroom to any stage of the legal procedure like the jury deliberations. The 1957 Hollywood film 12 Angry Men was a huge success, and it focused on the jury deliberations in the case of a homicide.
I don't care whether I'm alone or not. It's my right. It's your right. Why don't you take that stuff about the old man who lived there and heard everything?
Legal dramas are to be seen distinctly from police crime drama or detective fiction films, where the concern is with the investigative process. To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962, based on the novel by Margaret Mitchell, is an acclaimed legal drama directed by Robert Mulligan and was selected by the United States National Film Registry for preservation. Bollywood also has produced a number of remarkable courtroom dramas, and Mary Jung, 1985, directed by Subhash Ghai, is one of them. Anil Kapoor plays the central role of a man who becomes a lawyer to avenge the death of his father. Courtroom drama is a popular genre on the television too. Epic films. Epic films, another Hollywood initiative, are highly ambitious celluloid ventures done on a vast canvas, generally revolving around a historical or mythical event. True to its literary roots, it will have a heroic character as a protagonist. The definition of epic has it that the protagonist will be a mythic heroic figure whose actions decide on the destiny of a community or large groups of people. Extravagant settings, lavish costumes, a sweeping musical score, multiple casts of stars, etc. are regular features of epic films. In the course of the time, the term became synonymous with big budget filmmaking.
अमरेंद्र बाहुबली यानी मैं महिष्मति की असंख्य प्रजा और उनके धन, मान और प्राण की रक्षा करूंगा।
The genre had its golden period in the 1960s when Hollywood freely collaborated with foreign studios and moved to exotic locations in far-off countries. Iconic epic films in the period were El Cid 1961, Lawrence of Arabia 1962, Cleopatra 1963, The Fall of the Roman Empire 1964, etc. Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Padmavat 2018 and S.S. Rajamouli's Bahubali in 2 parts are acclaimed epic dramas produced in India. Fantasy films. Fantasy films date back to the very beginning of film industry, but the number of productions was relatively few in those days. In recent times, the development of computer-aided design technologies resulted in a surge in production of fantasy films. Films in the fantasy genre are known for its fantastic themes, mainly magical and supernatural events, drawing on mythology, folklore, and exoticism. This genre displays a close proximity to science fiction and horror films. Fantasies are deeply immersed in an ethereal setting of sorcery, wizardry, and highly improbable events. The fantasy titled Pirates of the Caribbean started in 2003, and the subsequent productions in the series proved to be phenomenal critical and commercial success. Film adaptations of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series too have accorded a lot of prestige to the fantasy genre. Gangster films. Gangster films center on organized crime and the gangs that execute them. Some of the Hollywood classics in the gangster category were made in the 1930s. Little Caesar, 1931, The Public Enemy, 1931, and Scarface, 1932 are some of the popular gangster movies of the times. Interestingly, the focus of the movie is on the organized nature of crime and the hardcore criminals involved. But the final conclusion often is that they are the product of the fault lines in the political, economic, and moral systems in the society. The big break in gangster movies came with the release of Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather in 1972. The intriguing story about the Italian-American gangsters, the Corleone family, and the Mafia left a huge mark on Hollywood in terms of commercial and critical success. In addition to the Oscar for the Best Picture, the film gave perennial fame to Marlon Brando for his lead role. Its sequel, The Godfather Part 2, also met with an equally enthusiastic response from the audience. The success of this formula resulted in the release of a series of gangster movies in the 1970s and 1980s. Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas 1990 is an outstanding example that received critical acclaim as well as popular appreciation.
Gangster.
By the time I grew up, there was...
The 2012 Indian film, The Gangs of Wasseypur, directed by Anurag Kashyap, created ripples with its stylized portrayal of vendetta among criminal gangs in the mining hinterland of India, replete with images of violence, corruption, and intrigue. Mystery movies. Films in the mystery genre are concerned with the solution to a problem or the detection of a criminal act. The central character is a detective, professional or amateur, who by means of astute deduction, clever interpretation of clues, and sheer intellectual brilliance zeroes in on the criminal. The unraveling of the crime depends on a lot of factors like the ability to read the clues correctly, judge the circumstances, and gain mental superiority over the criminal through smart interrogative sessions. Suspense is an essential ingredient of the plot. Sudden twists and turns may gift the audience with thrilling moments. The plot line in a mystery film may follow two patterns, the open and the closed. The first one reveals the identity of the perpetrator at the beginning, and the rest of the film is about the detective unraveling the perfect crime. The closed plot doesn't reveal the identity of the perpetrator until late into the story. Celluloid adaptations of Sherlock Holmes stories had a successful run at Hollywood with not less than 14 films made before 1931 and 1946. Mystery based on Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express 1974 is an all-time classic and had innumerable adaptations including in Indian languages.
This is no ordinary train. This is the legendary Orient Express.
The detective Hercule Poirot investigates the murder of an American business magnate aboard the train Orient Express. The film was directed by Sidney Lumet. Romantic comedies. A romantic comedy movie can be considered as a subgenre of comedy, and it revolves around uncomplicated, humorous plot lines, where two matching lovers are united or reconciled after steering clear of problems before them. The problems can be class differences, misunderstandings, or parental objections. The film doesn't forget to dole out the message that true love knows no hurdles. The prototype of a romantic comedy is nothing but a simple story in which the boy meets the girl, they fall in love, overcome the obstacles, and get married, and finally live happily ever after. We find the same stuff in much earlier theatre models like Shakespeare's romantic comedies too. Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream are good examples. Charlie Chaplin's silent classic of 1931, City Lights, is still considered to be one of the greatest romantic comedies ever. Chaplin's tramp falls in love with the blind girl and the plot is complicated as a result of his unlikely friendship with an alcoholic millionaire. The funny situations with twists and turns finally end up in the union of the two. Science fiction films. Science fiction film or sci-fi is a genre division based on highly speculative, fictional, science-based possibilities of the natural phenomena. Most of these speculations may not have any acceptance in the scientific community. Typically, a science fiction flick may consist of elements like time travel, alien worlds, extraterrestrial forms of life, robots, spacecraft, cyborgs, and so on. Makers of science fiction films are least bothered about the question of scientific plausibility. This genre had a history as old as the silent film, but the real breakthrough in science fiction film came with Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, released in the year 1968. Another landmark was George Lucas' Star Wars, 1977. The popularity of the internet and the cyberpunk gave rise to a series of films on the interaction between humans and computers. Matrix 1999 is a perfect example. 21st century witnessed further sophistication of sci-fi films with the utilization of computer-based special effects. Sports cinemas. Sports films use sports as the central theme of the text. Shimit Amin's film Chak De India, Go For It India 2007 is a perfect example of a sports film produced in Bollywood. The protagonist may be a sports person or an ardent follower of a sporting event. Development of the plot depends to a great extent on somebody's fortune in sports or a particularly crucial event like an important match. Sports films have a long history. The Karate Kid, released in the year 2010, was another remarkable sports film ever made.
This is Kung Fu.
Check it out!
Westerns. Westerns were the most popular Hollywood genre up to the 1960s. A film in the Western category deals with stories in the backdrop of the American Old West in the latter half of the 19th century. It will have cowboys and gunfighters riding a horse and armed with revolvers and rifles. Stetson hats, bandanas, cowboy boots, etc. are an essential part of the Western hero's paraphernalia. Native Americans, treasure hunters, lawbreakers, bandits, and rangers are found in abundance. These films present a crude system of justice, often described as Western justice, and that is intricately caught up with honor codes. The usual setting will be deserts and mountains, stressing on the harshness of the landscape. Stagecoach, the 1939 Western, had John Wayne in the lead role and it was directed by John Ford. Wayne plays the role of Ringo Kid, who had come out of the jail to avenge the murder of his father and brother. Typical of the Western tradition, it had shootouts, jailbreaks, uncertainty, the Apache tribesman, Geronimo, and a lot of thrilling actions. Like most Westerns of the period, Stagecoach is guilty of representing Native Americans as simplistic savages. Conflict with the natives is a stock theme of Westerns. The later films, more politically correct, accord a more honorable treatment to the natives. The blockbuster film Sholay 1975, directed by Ramesh Sippy, is described as a Bollywood version of the American Western. It centers on Thakur Baldev Singh's attempts to have revenge on the dreaded dacoit Gabbar Singh with the help of two small-time thieves played by Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra.
ठाकुर ने हिजड़ों की फौज बनाई है। मौत तुम्हारे सर पर खेल रही है कालिया।
Horror films. As a genre, horror films have a century-long history, and it aims at the evocation of fear for aesthetic purpose. The genre has obvious overlapping with fantasies and thrillers. The tradition can be traced back to classical authors like Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, and Edgar Allan Poe. Zombies, serial killers, stalkers, vampires, monsters, and ghosts recur in horror films. The 1920 German silent film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wiene, is a classic of the type. It was described as, I quote, the first true horror film, unquote, by critic Roger Ebert. Made in the German expressionist tradition, the film was a tremendous influence on horror films in the rest of the world. War films. War films dramatize the spectacle of warfare in all its manifestations on land, sea, and air. As far as possible, the attempt is to give a powerful experience of war to the viewer. These films explore a wide range of themes like combat, bond of friendship between soldiers, escapes, survival, and impact of war on society. 20th century saw a spike in the number of war films, precisely because of the political turbulence, including the two world wars. For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1943, directed by Sam Wood, is an evergreen film on the Spanish Civil War. It's based on the equally famous novel of the same title by Ernest Hemingway. The greatest number of war films has been made on the Second World War. Even while projecting the heroism of the fighters involved, war films sometimes present war as a futile enterprise and inhuman phenomenon. Disaster films. Disasters have been the subject of filmmaking since the time of silent movies. The basic plot line focuses on a tragedy, ongoing or impending. While projecting the spectacle of disaster, these films deal with the collateral scenes like the possible cause of the tragedy, its impact on the victims' survival attempts, etc. James Cameron's film Titanic 1997 is an outstanding example of this film genre. Disasters can be either natural or man-made, sometimes futuristic, at other times a contemporary possibility. Hugely dependent on special effects, on-site locations and multiple casts of stars, disaster films are big-budget affairs. Themes can be anything like earthquakes, nuclear radiation, floods, massive urban fire, attacks of aliens, or even accidents. Film noirs. The term in French means black film or dark film, and it has been used by French critics to refer to the many American crime and detective films released in France during and after the Second World War. There was an ambience of fear, mistrust, bleakness, despair, and paranoia in these films. On the technical front, they use low-key lighting, frequent flashbacks, intricate plots, and a brooding tone, and people it with ice-cold, cynical characters. Double Indemnity, 1944, directed by Billy Wilde, is regarded as a classic film noir and also a significant influence on later films. The overall murkiness of these films was caused by a sentiment of disillusionment and pessimism that pervaded the American mind of the time. Immediately after the Great Depression of the 1930s came the devastating Second World War. Added to this was the sense of uncertainty fueled by factors such as unstable economy, McCarthyism, and a sinister threat of atomic warfare. Foster Hirsch is a critic who has spiritedly argued in favor of the genre status of film noir. On the other hand, cinema historian Thomas Schwartz is not ready to allow the genre status to film noir. He would rather describe it as a style. Thank you for watching.